Hello. On the discussion board, in the notes that I just sent you in the announcement note, I am talking about internet fiction or electronic fiction, whatever you want to call it. Um, I kind of cover that there, and I bring that up because if you look at the online offerings for the Bax 2020 anthology, several of them are of that genre, internet fiction or electronic fiction. For the video, then, I want to shift focus a little bit and kind of, I guess, play off of another comment I made on the discussion board having to do with metaphor. And this is a very focused, kind of nuts and boltsy kind of thing I want to talk about this morning for a little bit here. And what I mentioned on the discussion board was that obviously a good metaphor can really liven up a piece of writing. But I think oftentimes we feel like one good metaphor, for whatever kind of comparison, a metaphor or simile is plenty. But really, we don't have to limit ourselves to just one metaphor or one simile to describe a particular, whatever person, object, activity. You can actually do several metaphors, two or three or four metaphors, perhaps, one right after another, or in a somewhat more complex way. And I mentioned a little correction here. I mentioned when I made that comment on the discussion board that I had picked that up from Saul Bellow way back when, and I attributed it to his novella Seize the Day. And so I was going to pull some examples from Seize the Day, but lo and behold, when I took a look, I couldn't really find any. And so then I realized it probably is more from Saul Bellow's novel, The Adventures of Augie March. And then I went to pull that off my bookcase, and I couldn't find it. I must have lost it somewhere along the way in some move. It's one of those tragic occurrences that can happen to someone, is to lose a book. So anyway, I wasn't able to draw any Saul Bellow examples. I did mention in my comment on the discussion board that another writer who does that is my own beloved William H. Gass. So plenty of gas on my bookcase. So I did grab some gas and very quickly found some examples of that, which I'm going to share with you in just a couple of minutes. And then I want to kind of take that a little bit farther in terms of how one might, further develop metaphor, etc. But I also wanted to kind of come back to the idea that, which we've talked about several times already this session, is on the one hand we're talking about experimental writing and cutting edge stuff and breaking new ground. But at the same time, there's really no such thing as totally new invention when it comes to storytelling. We've been telling stories to each other for millions of years, and we pretty much covered all the various ways you can do it. So we're largely kind of repeating ourselves. Now, nevertheless, as I've kind of paraphrased the German philosopher and critic Adorno, there's nothing new under the sun, but the true artist tries to find the new nevertheless. And so, in that spirit, I knew that one could go back, as far back as you can go in literature and find examples. And so, I want to actually begin by looking at Homer. Homer and his contemporaries, broadly defined over a few centuries, we used to do something which we call an epic simile. And an epic simile is basically a simile or a metaphor that is just kind of bigger and more complex than your typical one sentence, one image kind of metaphor. And Homer does it all the time in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, I've pulled up my Lombardo translation. I've got lots of translations of the Iliad and the Odyssey, just like I have lots of gas, etc. And I pulled Lombardo because he does this thing where he actually kind of indents and italicizes the epic similes which makes them super easy to find. And then when I pulled it off the shelf, I had all these little tabs stuck in there. Apparently, I've talked about this before in a paper or to some class somewhere along the way. So I'd already marked several of my favorites. So that was easy. That was fortuitous. So anyway, I want to just share a few of those. It's not exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the technique of giving multiple metaphors to elaborate on some sort of comparison. This is a little bit different, the epic simile, where what Homer is doing is going into like more depth about whatever metaphor he has decided to use, whatever simile he has decided to use. And so again, not exactly the same, but certainly the idea is the same in terms of we're going to not just stop at a simple expression. We're gonna take it farther. And then after we look at a couple of these, or three or four or five of these, it's hard to tear yourself away once you get started, really. We'll turn back to the master, William Gass, and go from there. So, so this is not something that was unique to Homer. We find it in a lot of ancient texts. And like I said, it's come to be called the Epic Simile. As I also mentioned, Lombardo will indent and italicize the epic similes, so they're really easy to spot in his translation. Really good translation, by the way, really terrific translation. His Iliad, especially, Odyssey, also good. Just a little side note here: Lombardo took a somewhat different approach to his translation of Homer, in that he started from the idea that it was an oral tradition that Homer was working with, and so these poems were intended to be performed, to be recited in public and so on. And so as he was developing his translations, he was mindful of that and tried to use language that would be more adaptable to public performance and recitation and so forth. So a little bit different feel, maybe somewhat less formal feeling than a lot of the translations of Homer. So anyway, that was just sort of Lombardo's kind of working premise. And I actually heard Lombardo perform, if you will, book 5 of the Odyssey at a conference. He was terrific. It was a really great experience. But anyway, let's look at a few of these epic similes that Homer gives us via Stanley Lombardo's translations. And again, just kind of pulling from here and there because they're really all over the place. So one could spend a great deal of time talking about these. But this is from book 6 of the Iliad, and I'll kind of read the first few lines and then kind of how Homer weaves the simile into the text. But it begins by saying Paris, as the guy who took Helen of Troy back to Greece. No, took Helen from Greece to Troy. Sorry, it's been a while. But anywho, Paris, meanwhile, did not dally long in his high halls. He put on his magnificent bronze inlaid gear and sprinted with assurance out through the city. And here's the epic simile. Picture a horse that is fed on barley in his stall, breaking his halter and galloping across the plain, making for his accustomed swim in the river, a glorious animal, head held high, mane streaming like wind on his shoulders, sure of his splendor. He prances by the horse runs and the mares in pasture. That ends the simile. That was how Paris, son of Priam, came down from the high rock. So we get, so rather than just saying Paris came down from the high rock like a magnificent horse, we get several lines describing a horse and how it moves along, trots along the barley field, et cetera, before Homer takes us back to that was how Paris, son of Priam, came down from the high rock. All right. Another example. This is from book 8 of the Iliad. We begin with, but the Trojans had great notions that night, sitting on the bridge of war by their watchfires. Then we go into the Epic Simile. Stars, crowds of them in the sky, sharp in the moon glow when the wind falls and all the cliffs and hills and peaks stand out and the air shears down from heaven and all the stars are visible and the watching shepherd smiles. In simile. So the bonfires between the Greek ships and the banks of the Xanthus burning on the plain before Ilion. And so again, we get the kind of a lengthy metaphor, 6 lines long, and then that's woven back into the text. That is how the watchfires looked like stars across the field, etc. All right. Let me do couple of others here. So this is from the opening of Book 10 of the Iliad. All the other leaders of the Greek alliance dozed through the night, subdued by soft sleep, but not Agamemnon. Sleep had no hold on the troubled mind of the army's commander. Into simile. Think of lightning. Hera's rich hair streams in the sky when her husband builds storms, heavy rain or unspeakable hail or snow that sifts down over cultivated land, or the barbed wire mouth of a battlefield. In simile. Thus Agamemnon, the density of the groans from his heart's deep core, his visceral fear. Notice that in these examples, oftentimes the metaphor is sort of a prelude to what's about to be described, right? Or what the metaphor is alluding to, which is a little bit different than we tend to do it in kind of standard storytelling today. We tend to say something, an object or an action, and then we perhaps give a metaphor to clarify it or to make it more dramatic or whatever it might be. Here, Homer is sort of doing the metaphor, the simile, prior to the thing that he's trying to describe. Maybe I just want to do one more, so I just want to find a particularly interesting one. This is from the climactic battle between Hector and Achilles in Book 22 of the Iliad. And so we start with, as Achilles bore down on Hector, and then simile. A hunting hound starts a fawn in the hills, follows it through breaks and hollows, and if it hides in a thicket, circles, picks up the trail, and renews the chase. Simile. No more could Hector elude Achilles. So here, Achilles is being compared to a particularly, stubborn and tenacious hunting hound. All right. So anyway, those are epic similes. They're all over the place in Homer. So we certainly can take a lesson from that, even though we're not writing mock epics, although I guess we could if we wanted to. It certainly is an idea that we could transfer to our own writing, the idea that metaphors don't have to be kind of one and done, just one simple comparison and then moving on, but rather we can sort of take our time and we can sort of have an extended metaphor. I mean, in poetry, we talk about extended metaphors where we start off with a particular conceit and then the poem kind of continues to build on that. So in poetry, and of course, technically speaking, the Iliad and the Odyssey are poems. But we still do it to some extent regularly in contemporary poetry, but we don't have to limit ourselves to just doing it when we're composing a poem. And as I keep talking about, in my mind, the difference between prose and poetry is virtually non-existent. That I think the best kind of prose writing has all sorts of poetic elements involved in it. And so we certainly could write metaphors and similes that were more extensive, that that expanded on the metaphor in ways that kind of illuminate even more so what it is we're trying to get through the comparison. Now, I want to turn my attention to gas, and again, we could look virtually anywhere in his, collected works that he wrote over nearly 40 years, or maybe actually 40 years. But I just went ahead and pulled this particular gas off my shelf. This is his last work of fiction, his collection of novellas and stories called Eyes. And I didn't have to look long to find what I was looking for. And so again, what I'm talking about here is that rather than just having a statement about this one character, this one action, or this one sunset, or whatever it is, and having one simile or metaphor to describe it, having two or three or more similes, metaphors, one right after another to describe it. We certainly don't have to stop at one. And so here are a couple of examples, although they really then lead to just a little bit further example or expansion of the example that I want to talk about. But this is from the lead novella in the collection, In Camera, and from section 1 of that novella, the stock. And just a little bit of background. The main character is a gentleman named Mr. Gab, G-A-B, and he owns a photography store, a store that sells photographic prints, kind of art prints, photography as art, if you will. And he has a shop that's described in some detail. And so, like, just on the very second page of this novella, we run into our first kind of complex or extended metaphor. Let me start here. Mr. Gad might still be sitting long after closing, long after nodding bye-bye to his stupid assistant, staring at his prints in the darkness, prints that covered the pock-marked walls of the shop, displayed there like dead things hung from nails. And then here we're getting into the string of metaphors, or similes, really. Like dead things hung from nails, as if slain while other prey were being hunted. And there's a colon there. While picking up fallen apples, maybe. Or rather, if a brace of grouse were to fling themselves into the apple bag. Or while gathering pig nuts, a pair of pigeons might creep into a handy box. While sorting buckeyes to find the feathers of a turkey, or while pulling loganberries out of their briaries, flushing a covey of quail instead. Anyway, prizes inadvertently taken, mistakenly developed, proudly framed. So he wants to compare these photographic prints to ones that appeared to be, not appeared to be, but were captured sort of instantaneously, almost accidentally. And so to get across this idea of capturing the image by accident almost, he goes through a series of similes about accidentally capturing different kinds of birds, grouse and pigeons and quail and so on. So one example, one such simile wasn't enough. He gives us several. And I think you also heard other poetic things happening in there in terms of alliteration and repetition and so on. Then just on the very next page, we're told, only during the evening following work, Mr. Gab thought of it as work, shortly after he had well dined, but before he went slowly to bed, unbuttoning the buttons down his shirt, his vest first, seeing the street or some other scene all the while, the buttons went as buttons do, loose from their hole. Not like released birds, because it was shirt that was freed, the vest that flew loose, even if it clung to his slender frame like a woman in a romance to her equally handmade lover. No, the buttons, like sentries, would stay sewn in their useful line, perhaps for an entire shirt life, vest time. In photographs, shirts do not get much attention. So here he's describing unbuttoning the shirt, and says it's not like birds being released. So this is sort of a negation of metaphor, but notice that he's returning to the avian theme of his other metaphor. No, these are like sentries, like guards that would stay sewn in their useful line, right? So not only do we have another metaphor that uses that same avian theme, but Gas kind of flips it and says it's not like that. All right. Well, then a few pages later, and this will be the last example from this story, but a few pages later, we're told Mr. Gabb was a stickler. His ideal was the perfect picture taken on the wing with one shot and allowed to emerge from its development like a chick its egg, so that one saw not just the subject supremely rendered, but a testimony to the unerring fineness of the photographer's eye, an eye unlike the painter's, he claimed, because the painter constructed, the painter made up his image as if the canvas were a face, while the photographer sought his composition like a hunter his prey, and took it away clean when it was found, to present in its purity as the result of an act of vision, the sort of seeing no one also employed what Mr. Gabb called slingshot sight. Painting took too long, sculpture, of course, was worse and encouraged thinking, permitted alterations, endured changes of mind, whereas the photographer came, saw, and shot in a rolleiflex action, in one unified gesture, like waving off a fly. So again, we have this kind of a complex metaphor about why Mr. Gabb thought that photography was superior to other art forms, and particularly he names painting and sculpting, because of the fact the photographer is more like a hunter who has to capture the image right now, right this second, whereas the painter and the sculptor over time can revise and and make all kinds of changes and change his mind and so forth and so on. So again, kind of a complex comparison there. But notice that the avian theme is returned to, and that's going to happen again and again and again in this novella. So that would be another kind of angle on the technique that I'm talking about. So not just using sort of a series of metaphors, but within a single short story or a novella or a novel, consistently come back to sort of the same kind of metaphor. I used to teach the novel Jane Eyre on a yearly basis, and in Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte has several metaphors at work. One of them is avian. And so the narrator, who is Jane, kind of telling her own story, refers to things again and again and again, like birds, or using bird, names and actions and so forth. And other authors, Shakespeare and Macbeth. Macbeth is just filled with avian imagery and so on. So again, not unique to Gas, certainly to pick a particular, kind of theme for the metaphor. And of course, the theme one chooses, one would imagine, has something important to do with whatever the piece as a whole is about, right? So that is Gass's use of extended metaphor, extended sort of thematic metaphor, if you will, in his collection Eyes. Highly recommend. Now, the other thing I want to talk to very, very briefly is another Gass piece, and that is a little novella, Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife. The last, few times I've taught this class, we read Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife. It's a highly experimental novella that Gass published in 1968. And like I said, he was trying all kinds of things. In fact, a lot of his ideas just couldn't be replicated given the technology of the time period. And so the typesetter and so forth, the graphic designers did the best they could. But I've done a couple of papers on Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife, and I went to the Gass archive at WashU, at Washington University, St. Louis, and and it's just amazing what he wanted to do. There were all kinds of weird ideas he wanted to try to employ in this novella that he just couldn't make happen because it just wasn't literally wasn't physically possible at the time. But as I say, it was ultimately published as a special supplement in Tri-Quarterly, which is a very prestigious literary journal. It was a special supplement number 2 in 1968. In it, Gass is doing all kinds of things, including using different color paper, different types of paper. Not very good at this. Having coffee rings appear in the text and so forth and so on. And so, again, just all kinds of things, playing with different sorts of typography and so on. Now, ultimately, after it came out in supplement form, it was published in hardcover editions. And in the hardcover editions, all kinds of fun stuff happens, including some really cool end pages, and they tried to, maintain the same stuff that was going on in the original supplement. It ultimately came out in paperback editions, of which I own several. This is my my reader edition, because it's got notes and stuff in it. But I have several editions. It took me a long time to track down the original 1968 Tri-Quarterly supplement. It took me a few years contacting rare book dealers across the internet and so forth before finally finding a copy, or at least a copy I could afford. But anyhow, I have several versions. But the reason I wanted to point this out, besides the fact that we normally do read this book in this course, and this time we weren't able to because the bookstore contacted me over the summer and let me know that unfortunately they couldn't guarantee that there'd be enough copies available for everybody in the class. So I cut it from the reading list, which was okay because in the sense that when we went from the longer number of weeks to the shorter number of weeks, it was pretty tight to try to get everything in this class. So we were able to spend more time with the anthology, and then also with Shelley Jackson's collection that we're about to read. So it did free up some time for those other works. But obviously, it's a little sad to think that it's getting to be out of print. Hopefully, that was just a temporary situation, because I highly recommend it. But Gass ultimately thought that the book was a failure, that a lot of the stuff he was experimenting with in terms of technique, it was kind of interesting and, yeah, whatever. But ultimately, it wasn't very effective in terms of narrative. And so he kind of got away from that highly ambitious sort of experimentation, and stuck more to just straight prose, and experimented more with his language, and not so much the appearance of language on the page and other sort of graphic elements and so on. Now, I think the master was wrong. I think it works really well and is really, really interesting. And I'm going to read just a bit of it to you in just a minute. But one of the other reasons I wanted to bring it up is because the entire novella is an extended metaphor. And Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife, um, the title refers to the metaphor that a wife who is lonely for her husband and is not being attended to, use your imagination, is like a book that isn't being read. A book needs to be loved and needs to be handled and thought about and understood, um, just as someone should their partner, their spouse in life, right? So it's an extended metaphor throughout the entire novella that a lonesome wife is like a lonesome book. And of course there's all sorts of more detailed sort of precise comparisons within that. Now, I will say that again, this novella came out in 1968. For a lot of folks, it hasn't aged well. It seems it certainly can seem sort of sexist and sort of objectifying. But again, at the time, those weren't necessarily things that were as prominent in our society as they are today, and it's a good thing they are today. I'm certainly in line with all of that. So we always have to think about the book in its kind of historical context. But anyway, I find it very, very inspiring, and the idea of experimentation as it is sort of represented in the book to be very inspiring. And so I want to read just a bit from the very, very end of Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife. And I'm going to edit just a bit to remove some of the saltier language, so this is appropriate for, viewing wherever. But Gass writes, and again, this is the very end of the novella. Let us have a language worthy of our world, a democratic style where rich and well-born nouns can roister with some verb, yet find themselves content and complained of. We want a diction which contains the quaint, the rare, the technical, the obsolete, the old, the lent, the nonce, the local slang and argot of the street in neighborly confinement. Our tone should suit our time, uncommon quiet dashed with common thunder. It should be as young and quick and sweet and dangerous as we are, experimental and expansive, venturesome enough to make the chemist envy and the physicist catch up. It will give new glasses to new eyes and put those plots and patterns down where we find our modern lot in. Metaphor must be its God now, gods are metaphors. It should not be too cowardly of song, but show its substance, sing its tunes so honestly and loud that even eyes can hear them, and contrive to be a tongue that is its own intoxicant. Full of the future, cruel to the past, this time we live in is so much in blood with possibility and dangerous chance, so mixed with every color, life and death, the good and bad homogenized like milk in everything we think. New men, new terrors, new plans. That Alexander regrets his love of drink. Elizabeth, that only queen, paused for her wig to seek employment, and the swift Achilles runs against his death to be here. It's not the languid prose we need, but poetry, the human muse, full up and on the charge, impetuous and hot and loud and wild, like Messalina going to the stews, or those damn rockets streaming headstrong into the stars. So the end of Willie Masters is a call to arms, so to speak, for all writers, all creative types, to say goodbye to tradition, to say goodbye to the tame, and the sort of bashful, and to experiment. Do what we can with language, do what we can with graphic elements. The times demand them. Interestingly, again, it was published in 1968. Obviously composed somewhat before then, but this is the Vietnam era, and of course, as you know, 1968 was a particularly chaotic year. Protests, demonstrations, riots, and so on. And so, Gass is kind of calling artists and writers to, excuse me, to speak to the times. And here we are in 2021, on the verge of 2022. I think our times are just as chaotic and just as dangerous, maybe even more so, frankly, than 1968. Um, we've had the Capitol attacked. We have propaganda machines that are doing everything they can to endanger everyone they can. And and what can we do as writers and artists? Obviously, we can get involved in political activism, and those kinds of things. But we also can use our voice, and through our voice, I mean also our pen, our paintbrush, our fingerboards on the computer for digital art and digital prose and electronic literature, if you will. And we too can be bold and brash and try to speak to our times, just as Gass was trying to do in 1968. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I encourage you to make some comments in the announcements thread. Ask questions. Give me some examples of your own. Always feel free to disagree or to contradict. And I look forward to seeing you down the digital road.